There's a type of destruction that leaves no bruises, no police reports, no evidence you could show anyone. You walk into work looking the same as always. Your friends see nothing different. Your family has no idea. But inside, something has been dismantled, piece by piece, day by day. So slowly you didn't even notice it happening until you woke up one morning and couldn't recognize the man in the mirror. I'm talking about psychological violence, the kind that never raises its voice, never throws a punch, never gives you a clear moment where you can say, that's when it happened. It's subtler than that. It's a tone of voice, a facial expression held half a second too long. A pause before answering, a sigh that says everything without saying anything. It's the slow, systematic erosion of a man's sense of self, conducted so quietly that he doesn't even know he's under attack. Today we're going to talk about how men are psychologically broken without being touched, how it happens, why it works, why men don't notice until it's too late, and what's actually going on beneath the surface of relationships that look perfectly normal from the outside but are silently destroying the man inside them. Let me start with something most men will never admit. Your sense of who you are, your confidence, your drive, your belief in yourself, is heavily influenced by how your woman perceives you. I know, you're supposed to be internally validated. You're supposed to derive your worth from within. You're supposed to be unshakable, grounded in your own evaluation of yourself regardless of what anyone else thinks. And in theory, that's true. But in practice, for most men, the woman in their life functions as a mirror, and what they see reflected back shapes how they see themselves. When she looks at you with admiration, you feel capable. When she laughs at your jokes, you feel funny. When she responds to you with desire, you feel desirable. When she trusts your decisions, you feel competent. Her perception becomes data that feeds your self-image. This isn't weakness. It's how intimate relationships work. You're bonded. You're connected. Her view of you matters because she matters. But here's where it gets dangerous. If her admiration can build you up, her contempt can tear you down. And this is exactly what happens in relationships where a man is being psychologically dismantled. The admiration that existed at the beginning, the way she looked at you, laughed at your jokes, hung on your words, it starts to fade. Not dramatically, not suddenly, just gradually. And in its place comes something else. Neutrality, disinterest, and eventually barely concealed contempt. The shift is so gradual that you don't notice it happening. One day she thinks you're amazing. The next day she thinks you're fine. The next month she thinks you're tolerable. The next year she wonders why she settled. And you're absorbing all of this through 1,000 tiny signals that never quite rise to the level of problem. There's no fight, no accusation, just a slow drift from warmth to coldness that rewrites your internal operating system without your permission. Let me describe what these signals actually look like, because this is where men get confused. They're waiting for something obvious, something they can point to and say, that's unacceptable. But the destruction doesn't come from obvious things. It comes from micro-disrespect, the accumulation of tiny moments that individually mean nothing but collectively devastate. It's the eye roll when you share an idea. It's the sigh before she answers your question. It's the way she looks at her phone while you're talking. It's the half-second delay before she responds, just long enough to communicate that your words aren't urgent. It's the joke at your expense in front of friends that everyone laughs at but leaves you feeling small. It's the correction of minor details in your stories, as if accuracy matters more than your dignity. It's the lack of enthusiasm when you accomplish something. It's the way she says, okay, flat, disengaged, barely acknowledging you spoke. None of these are crimes. None of them justify a confrontation. If you brought any single one up, you'd sound paranoid. She rolled her eyes once and you're upset. She corrected your story and now you're offended. Each incident is dismissible. That's precisely what makes the pattern so effective. You can't fight what you can't name. You can't resist what you can't identify. And so you absorb it. Day after day, microsignal after microsignal, until your sense of yourself has been completely rewritten. Here's what's happening psychologically. In the early stages of a relationship, she gave you admiration freely. She looked at you like you were special. She laughed easily. She was impressed by things you did. This admiration functioned as positive reinforcement. It felt good. It made you feel valuable. It bonded you to her because she was a source of that feeling. Then gradually the admiration was withdrawn. Not all at once, that would be too obvious, just incrementally reduced. The laughs became less frequent. The impressed looks disappeared. The enthusiasm dimmed. And now you're in a situation where you remember what it felt like to be admired by her, but you can't access it anymore. You know it's possible because it used to happen. So you try to earn it back. You do more, you try harder, you seek her approval in ways you never did before. This is emotional conditioning. The early admiration created dependency. The withdrawal of admiration created hunger. And now you're in a loop, working to restore something that she controls completely. She became the gatekeeper of your self-worth, without you ever agreeing to give her that power. And every time she withholds approval, you feel the deficit. Every time she grants a small amount, you feel relief. You're being trained like a lab rat pressing a lever for pellets that come less and less frequently. And here's the cruel part. The harder you try to earn her approval, the less attractive you become. Because the trying itself communicates that you've accepted a lower position. You're no longer the man she admired, you're the man seeking her admiration. The dynamic has flipped. You went from someone she looked up to into someone who looks up to her, and that inversion kills whatever attraction remained. This is what I call the collapse of masculine polarity. In the beginning, there was a natural dynamic. You led, she followed. You were grounded, she was drawn to that groundedness. You had a frame, and she existed within it. That's polarity. That's what creates attraction. But when respect disappears, polarity disappears with it. You become reactive instead of proactive, anxious instead of calm, approval-seeking instead of self-assured. The very qualities that made her want you in the first place have been systematically stripped away, not by anything you did, but by how her treatment of you rewired your psychology. Let me talk about something that happens deep inside a man during this process. He starts to adopt her evaluation as truth. This is critical to understand. When someone you love, someone you're bonded to, consistently treats you as if you're mediocre, your brain starts to believe it. Not because you've examined the evidence and concluded she's right, but because her perception starts to feel like reality. You stop asking, "Who am I?" and start asking, "How do I look in her eyes?" Your self-image becomes a function of her judgment. If she seems disappointed, you feel disappointing. If she seems unimpressed, you feel unimpressive. If she seems to tolerate you rather than want you, you feel tolerable at best. Her internal state becomes your internal state, reflected through the bond you share, and since her internal state toward you has been trending negative for months or years, your internal state about yourself follows. This is how a man can have a successful career, good health, loyal friends, money in the bank, all the external markers of competence, and still feel worthless. Because his primary measure of self has become one person's view, and that person has decided he's not enough. The external evidence doesn't matter. He feels what she projects, and what she projects is disappointment. Let me address something men confuse constantly: the difference between love and evaluation. In a healthy relationship, your partner loves you, accepts you, is on your team. Yes, they see your flaws. Yes, they might wish some things were different, but fundamentally, they're with you, not assessing whether to be with you. In the dynamic I'm describing, love has been replaced by constant evaluation. The man feels perpetually assessed, judged, ranked against some standard he can never quite reach. The relationship isn't a partnership, it's an ongoing audit, and he's always coming up short. He lives with the sense that his position is conditional, that he's on probation, that any moment the verdict could come in and he could be found wanting. This destroys a man in ways that are hard to articulate. Because you can't relax in your own relationship. You can't feel secure in your own home. You're always performing, always trying to prove something, always aware that you're being watched and measured. The person who should be your safe harbour has become your most demanding critic. And you've internalized the criticism so deeply that you don't even question whether it's fair. You just assume it must be accurate because why else would she feel this way? Here's what happens to a man's life when this sets in. His initiative collapses. Think about what initiative requires. It requires believing that your efforts will lead to positive outcomes. It requires confidence that your judgment is sound enough to take risks. It requires a fundamental sense that you're capable, competent, worthy of success. When a man has been psychologically broken, when he's internalized a view of himself as mediocre, disappointing, not enough, that foundation crumbles. Why take risks when you'll probably fail? Why pursue ambitions when you don't deserve success? Why lead when your judgment clearly can't be trusted? The beliefs that underpin action have been corrupted, and so action stops. This is why you see men who were once driven become passive, men who were once creative become stuck, men who once led become followers. It's not laziness, it's learned helplessness. They've been trained through thousands of micro-interactions to believe that they're not capable. And people don't take initiative from a place of incapacity. They retreat, they shrink, they stop trying. Not because they chose to give up, but because their psychology was systematically reprogrammed to expect failure. Let me contrast something important: how a man is treated in public versus how he's treated at home. Because often these are completely different, and the contrast itself is part of the damage. In public, he might have status, a title at work, respect from colleagues, authority in his field. People listen when he speaks. His opinions matter. He's treated as competent, capable, someone worth taking seriously. He walks through the world receiving signals that he has value. Then he comes home, and everything inverts. The respect disappears, the authority dissolves. The tone shifts from deference to tolerance at best, contempt at worst. The same man who commanded a meeting is now being dismissed over how he loaded the dishwasher. The same man whose expertise people pay for is now being corrected on trivial details by someone who communicates, in every gesture, that he's not impressive. This whiplash is disorienting, but more than that, it attacks the deeper reality. Because at some level, a man knows that the public version is performance. Titles can be given and taken. Professional respect is transactional. But home, the place where you're supposed to be known truly, loved unconditionally, that feels like the real measure. And if the measure at home says you're worthless, the public success starts to feel hollow. A costume you wear, not who you really are. The humiliation isn't loud, it's intimate, it's casual. It happens in the quiet moments that no one else sees, and that's precisely why it's so damaging. Public humiliation, at least, creates witnesses, sympathy, a clear villain. Private humiliation creates only doubt. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe she's right. Maybe I really am the problem. Let me explain why men don't notice this is happening until it's too late. The answer is simple. There's no single dramatic event. No line that gets crossed so clearly that response is mandatory. It's all gradual, all incremental, all deniable. The human brain is terrible at detecting slow change. We're built for immediate threats. The tiger in the grass, the cliff edge approaching. We notice sudden shifts. But when something changes 1% per week, 52% per year, we adapt without realizing we're adapting. Each day looks basically like the day before. It's only when you zoom out to years that the transformation becomes visible. This is exactly how psychological violence works. Each individual incident is absorbable. She was just tired. She's stressed from work. It's not a big deal. And so you absorb it. And the next one. And the next. You adapt to a slightly lower baseline of treatment, then you adapt again. And again. Your tolerance keeps adjusting downward while you tell yourself nothing significant is changing. By the time you realize something is deeply wrong, your self-image has already been rewritten. The man you were 5 years ago has been replaced by the man you are now, and you can't quite remember how it happened. There was no decision point, no moment of clarity, just a slow fade from confident to broken, with each step feeling like normal life. I want to address a myth that enables all of this. The myth that it's just words, or it's just tone, or it's just a look. Men are told to brush these things off. Don't be so sensitive. It's not like she hit you. Sticks and stones and all that. But this is catastrophically wrong. Psychological violence doesn't require aggression. It requires withdrawn respect. It requires the consistent communication through 1,000 small signals that you are not valued, that you're not enough, that your presence is tolerated rather than desired. These communications don't need to be loud. They don't need to be explicit. They just need to be persistent. A man can survive being yelled at. He can recover from a fight. He can even endure occasional cruelty if it's followed by repair. But he cannot survive years of ambient contempt, of casual dismissal, of being made to feel in ways that never rise to the level of obvious abuse that he is disappointing simply by existing. That's the weapon. Not words themselves, but what words communicate. Not tone itself, but what tone conveys. The message is, you are not enough. And when that message is delivered daily for years, it becomes belief. Here's the final stage, the trap that completes the destruction: self-blame. The man concludes that the problem is him alone. He doesn't recognize the relational dynamic. He doesn't see the systematic erosion that occurred. He just knows he feels worthless, and he assumes that feeling must be accurate. I must be flawed. I must be weak. I must be insufficient. He diagnoses himself as broken without ever identifying what broke him. This is the perfect endpoint for psychological violence. The victim becomes his own prison guard. He no longer needs her contempt to feel bad about himself. He's internalized it. He delivers the contempt to himself now, in her voice, with her judgment, but running entirely on automatic inside his own head. The abuse has become self-sustaining. She could leave tomorrow and he'd still hear her disappointment. She could die and he'd still feel her judgment. The programming is complete, and here's what makes recovery so difficult. When a man has been broken this way, he doesn't even know what happened to him. He just knows he's not functioning. He's lost confidence, lost drive, lost sense of self. He might go to therapy and talk about depression. He might try medication. He might read self-help books about motivation. But none of these address the actual cause, because the cause isn't inside him. It's in a relational dynamic he was never taught to see. He'll try to fix himself while staying in the relationship that broke him. He'll wonder why he can't seem to improve despite all his efforts. He'll conclude he must be more broken than he thought. The therapy isn't working, the medication isn't working, the books aren't working. What he doesn't realize is that you cannot heal while the wound is still being inflicted. You cannot recover self-worth while living with someone who systematically erodes it. The treatment fails because the diagnosis is wrong. Let me tell you what this looks like from the outside, because you've probably seen these men without knowing what you were looking at. He used to be driven. Now he's just going through the motions. He used to have opinions. Now he defers on everything. He used to make decisions confidently. Now he second-guesses himself constantly. He used to have presence. Now he fades into the background of his own life. His friends notice he's different, but can't articulate how. His family sees him less, but doesn't question why. His colleagues watch his performance decline, but attribute it to stress or age. No one connects the dots to his relationship because the relationship looks fine from the outside. No fighting, no drama. Just two people living together who seem stable. Stable like a car slowly leaking oil. Stable like a foundation with hairline cracks. The catastrophe is already in progress. It's just not visible yet. And by the time it becomes visible, a breakdown, a collapse, a sudden exit, everyone will be shocked. I had no idea. They seemed fine. What happened? What happened is that a man was disassembled over years, piece by piece, signal by signal, until there was nothing left but the shell, and the person responsible will express concern. We'll wonder what went wrong with him, or maybe even comfort him as he crumbles, because the violence was invisible, because the weapon left no marks, because she can tell herself, and she might even believe it, that she never did anything wrong. Let me talk about why men are particularly vulnerable to this. Men are socialized to ignore emotional information, to be stoic, to tough it out, to not make a big deal of feelings. This serves them in many contexts, but in this context it's catastrophic, because the breakdown happens entirely in the emotional realm, and a man who's trained to ignore his emotions is a man who won't notice his own destruction until it's complete. She can deliver 1,000 contemptuous signals, and he'll dismiss each one. It's nothing. I'm being sensitive. Focus on what matters. He's outsourcing his emotional awareness to a value system that says emotions don't matter. Meanwhile, those dismissed emotions are accumulating. The psychological damage is compounding, and he's actively suppressing the very awareness that might save him. By the time the damage breaks through his suppression, by the time he can no longer ignore that something is deeply wrong, it's advanced. Like a cancer that wasn't screened for. By the time symptoms appear, it's metastasized. The man who finally admits, "I feel broken," is usually describing a state that's been building for years. He just didn't let himself notice until it became undeniable. Let me give you a framework for understanding what's happened if you recognize yourself in any of this. It's not that you're weak. It's not that you're inherently flawed. It's that you were subjected to a systematic campaign of psychological erosion by someone who controlled your primary source of intimate validation. The decline wasn't your failure. It was an induced condition. This reframe matters. Because as long as you blame yourself entirely, you can't address the actual cause. You'll keep trying to fix something internal while the external assault continues. You'll keep wondering why self-improvement doesn't work while living with someone who undoes every improvement through ambient contempt. The first step to recovery is recognition, seeing the pattern, understanding that what you've been absorbing wasn't just normal relationship friction. It was destruction dressed as mundane unhappiness. It was violence that never raised its voice. Once you see it, you can name it. Once you name it, you can start to choose how to respond, and the response usually has to involve separation. I know men don't want to hear this. They want a fix that keeps the relationship intact. They want to believe that if they just explain things correctly, she'll change. But psychological violence, like physical violence, doesn't stop because you ask nicely. It stops when you remove yourself from the situation, or when the situation changes so fundamentally that the dynamic is destroyed. You cannot negotiate your way to respect with someone who's lost respect for you. You cannot communicate your way to admiration with someone who views you with contempt. The feelings aren't intellectual positions that can be debated. They're emotional realities that exist regardless of your arguments. And as long as you stay, trying to convince her to feel differently, you're proving you don't have the self-respect to leave, which only deepens her contempt. The paradox is brutal. Leaving might be the only thing that earns her respect, but by the time you've been broken down enough to need that respect, you often don't have the psychological resources to leave. The trap is nearly perfect. The abuse destroys the capacity to escape the abuse. So, what do? First, you get external perspective. Talk to friends. Talk to a therapist, but one who understands relational dynamics, not one who will just medicate your symptoms. Talk to men who've been through this. Get outside the bubble of the relationship where her reality has become the only reality. You need other mirrors, other sources of reflection, because the mirror she's providing is distorted, and you've been staring into it so long you think it's accurate. Second, you rebuild alternative sources of self-worth. This is why I constantly emphasize having a life outside the relationship. Career, fitness, friendships, purpose. These aren't just good for you generically. They're protection against exactly this situation. When your self-worth has multiple foundations, one person's contempt can't collapse the entire structure. When your identity is diversified, one failing asset doesn't bankrupt you. Third, you start testing boundaries. You say no to things you've been accepting. Fourth, you make peace with the possibility of leaving, not as a manipulation tactic, not as a threat, as a genuine option that you're genuinely willing to exercise. Because boundaries without willingness to enforce them are just suggestions, and suggestions get ignored. You need to know, deep in your bones, that you can survive without her. That leaving, while painful, is preferable to continued erosion. Only then do you have real leverage. Only then can anything actually change. Let me close with something important. If you've recognized yourself in this video, if you feel that slow hollowing out I've described, know that the recognition itself is significant.